Chapter 10, The Hollow King. The unweaving spire had no windows. Curran had designed it that way. Windows invited the sky in, and the sky in Lumen was too beautiful, too forgiving, and he needed this space to remain what it was, purposeful. A place for work, not wonder. The transmitter itself occupied the center of the chamber like a spine pulled free of some enormous creature. It rose from floor to ceiling in a column of latticed brass and memory thread filament, its core packed with resonance coils that hummed at a frequency just below hearing. Curran felt it more in his back teeth than his ears. He pressed 2 fingers against the outer casing and held them there, feeling the faint warmth radiating through the metal. Not yet active, not yet singing, but close. Davin was already waiting when he arrived, which was unusual. His second-in-command arrived precisely on time, never before, and Curran had always respected this about him, the way other men respected a reliable blade. But this morning, Davin stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching Curran come through the lower door with the expression of a man who had rehearsed something unpleasant.
"You've been up all night,"
Curran said, not a question.
The core calibration threw an error at third tide. And
Davin's voice was flat. Flat was how he expressed concern.
we corrected it, but it expanded the dispersal radius.
Curran walked a slow circle around the base of the spire. The floor here was bare metal plating, and his footsteps rang out in the cold air with a clarity that felt surgical. He checked the filament array on the east quadrant, running his thumb along the coils, feeling for heat imbalances.
"By how much?"
He said.
14%.
He stopped walking.
"That's significant."
The whole of Calora falls within range now, not just the market ring and the Holloway Warrens, the residential tiers, the upper terraces.
Davin paused.
The children's facilities.
The air between them was cold enough that Curran could see the faint ghost of his own breath. He watched it dissipate before answering.
Children carry the least accumulated trauma. The pulse will have minimal effect on underdeveloped resonance profiles.
That's not what the research says.
What does the research say, Davin?
It wasn't a question either. The way Curran said things, the soft and level way, had a gravity to it. People answered him not because they were afraid, exactly, but because refusing felt like swimming uphill. Davin knew this. He answered anyway.
That children who haven't yet formed complete memory architecture are more susceptible to structural dissolution. That if the pulse runs at full amplitude across the expanded radius, we're not talking about erasing painful memories. We're talking about erasing the connective tissue between memories, the sense of self, the continuity.
He uncrossed his arms and pressed his knuckles against the plating of the spire.
We'd be dissolving who they are, Kieran, not what hurt them.
The hum from the transmitter rose a fraction, some internal regulation cycling through its sequence, and the filaments along the top third of the spire flickered with a cold blue light, like something breathing. Curran turned from the east quadrant and looked at Davin directly. This was the other thing people found difficult about him. When he gave you his full attention, it felt total, like being examined by something that had learned to look like a person.
Everyone who suffers in Lumen
He said quietly.
Suffers because they remember what they lost. The woman in the lower tiers who watched the cascade recall take her husband's name from him and still hears him calling for someone he can't find. The boy in Sector 9 who carries 3 generations of grief in 3 extracted crystals because his family thought preservation was love.
He stepped closer to Davin, not threatening, never threatening, simply present.
They suffer because the people who were supposed to protect them decided that memory was sacred. More sacred than peace. More sacred than them.
Davin didn't step back.
I know what they suffer. I've sat with them.
Then you know why this is mercy.
Mercy has a boundary, Kieran.
His voice hardened to something close to anger, which was the most emotion Curran had ever heard in it.
Mercy doesn't dissolve a 7-year-old's sense of her own name because some coil threw an error, and we expanded the blast radius without asking whether we should.
Silence followed this, the kind of silence that has weight. Curran turned back to the spire. He laid his palm flat against the central casing, and the warmth there was steadier than before, more even, as if the machine was settling into itself. He stood like that for a long moment with his eyes half closed, and if someone had walked in they might have thought he was praying.
We can't reduce the radius without compromising the depth of the pulse.
He said.
If the pulse doesn't reach full depth, it skims the surface. It takes away the narrative of pain but leaves the feeling. People wake up hollow, frightened. They don't know why they're grieving, but they grieve regardless. I've seen it.
His voice stayed soft. It always stayed soft.
A half measure is not mercy. It is a cruelty with better optics.
Davin was quiet for a moment.
And the children.
We'll grow up in a world that doesn't have this weight in the atmosphere. They'll build memories unburdened by inherited grief.
Curran removed his hand from the casing.
Every generation has always paid some cost for the world the previous one built. We are simply being honest about it.
That's an interesting way to say we're deciding for them.
The words hung in the cold air. Curran tilted his head slightly, the way he did when something surprised him, which was rare.
Yes,
He said.
we are. Because no one decided for us. And look what we became.
Davin closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the argument had gone out of his face, replaced by something older and more tired. He turned and moved toward the instrument panel along the western wall, pulling up the calibration logs with the practiced efficiency of someone surrendering to the inevitable.
The secondary coils need manual alignment before we run the activation sequence.
He said.
I'll need you at the upper chassis. And
Curran was already moving to the ladder at the spire's base.
How long?
2 hours, maybe 3 if the east array is as misaligned as I think.
He climbed without another word. The metal rungs were cold under his hands, the chill of dawn at this altitude working through his gloves and into his knuckles. Above him, the filaments cast that pale blue light across everything, and the hum rose with each meter he gained, pressing into his chest now, settling behind his sternum like a second heartbeat. He didn't look down at Davin. He didn't need to see the expression on his second's face to know what was there. Resignation wasn't the same as agreement. He'd learned to stop confusing the two. The transmitter breathed around him. Below the spire, the sky of lumen was beginning to lighten, the violet dark softening toward a pale gray at its edges, the distant islands emerging from the night like bruises fatting. Curran couldn't see any of this. The spire had no windows. He climbed. The apex was a small space. He'd made it small deliberately, a single circular platform no wider than 4 arm spans, railed on 3 sides with a lattice of memory thread wire that caught the morning light and broke it into something like prismatic dust. The 4th side was open. No railing. No barrier between the edge of the platform and the open sky of lumen dropping away into violet nothing. He had designed this too. The cold up here was different from the cold below. Below it was a mechanical cold, the cold of metal and sealed chambers and recycled air. Up here it was alive. It moved across his face and found the places where his skin was thinnest, just below his jaw, along the ridge of his ears, and pressed in like a thumb. He stood at the open edge and let it do this. He let himself be touched by something that did not need anything from him. Sky was gray-gold at its lowest horizon, the bruised violet of true night still holding at the upper reaches, and between those two colors the light existed in a state of almost day, almost clarity. The distant islands of the mid-chain hung in the haze like half-remembered words, their bioluminescent bloom clusters not yet lit, dormant until the tide wind came. They looked like sleeping things. He had an instinct, which he never spoke aloud, that they were aware. He reached into his inner pocket. The crystal was wrapped in a square of thermal cloth, folded precisely at the corners because he had folded and refolded it so many times that his hands did it without instruction now. He unwrapped it the way he always did, slowly, the cloth falling back layer by layer until the crystal sat exposed in his palm. It was small, the size of a child's molar. Irregular at its facets in the way that organic crystals always were, not grown in a lab matrix but formed from the living process of a mind holding a memory so tightly it calcified. It was warm, not the warmth of the thermal cloth. He'd known that distinction for 5 years. The cloth was neutral warmth, even, flat, the warmth of an object holding borrowed heat. The crystal's warmth was different. It moved. Slightly, nearly imperceptibly, a fluctuation of temperature that corresponded to nothing external. A pulse, almost. Not quite. He had spent a long time not allowing himself to use that word. It caught the gray-gold light and held it, and for a moment the facets along its upper edge glowed a soft amber, something between gold and grief, and he looked at it and said nothing. His thumb moved to its surface without his full permission. The pad of his thumb found the largest facet and rested there, and beneath the crystal's warmth he felt the faint vibration that was not quite sound and not quite sensation, but something in the space between. A frequency. The resonance of a mind he had broken and never been able to put back the right way.
I know.
He said, his voice came out rough. At this altitude, in this cold, everyone's voice roughed. He told himself this.
I know you can't hear me.
He turned slightly away from the open edge, not retreating from it but redistributing his weight. The crystal rested in his palm.
That isn't the point.
He had tried, in the years after, to explain the distinction to himself in clinical terms. A fragment of encoded neural resonance was not a consciousness. It was a record, a preserved moment of electrical pattern that the organic mind had been producing when the extraction occurred. It was no more alive than a shadow cast on a wall was alive. The person who made the shadow might be gone, and the shadow would remain, defined by an absence it could not perceive. He knew this. His thumb moved along the facet. She had been 6. He hadn't known that when he hacked into the system. He had known Alira's access credentials, had known the prototype's architectural weaknesses because he'd argued with her about them for 3 months before they stopped speaking, had known exactly what the tech could do to a developing mind that hadn't yet finished knitting itself together, and he had gone in that night to shut it down before it damaged anyone. That was what he told himself then. That was what he had told himself on every morning since, on good days, on the mornings when he could still almost make himself believe it. What he had actually done was panic. The word sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He didn't push it away. Pushing it away was how other people managed their grief. The people who came to him in the Holloway Hollows with their hands out and their eyes already halfway gone, begging him to take the weight of what they knew. He had never fully indulged that particular mercy for himself. He kept the stone. He had to keep something.
She said your name.
He said to the crystal.
When the system started cycling into emergency mode, she was in the mapping chair and she said, Mama. And then the signal scattered and I couldn't stop it. I couldn't reverse the extraction once the resonance had begun to split.
He watched the amber light in the crystal's facets.
I tried. You don't know that. Alira doesn't know that. No one knows that. Because by the time I had something coherent in my hands, the frame was gone and you were.
He stopped. The crystal pulsed warmth. He closed his fingers around it. Not hard. The way you hold something you know is fragile, which is to say, with awareness, with the constant modulation of your own strength against the possibility of damage. He had been holding his own strength against the possibility of damage for so long that he was not sure he knew any more how to simply grip something. Below the spire and below the platform, and below the invisible floors of Holloway's stacked infrastructure, the city was waking. He could not see it from here. He could hear, very faintly at the edge of perception, the distant mechanical groan of a gravity anchor cycling through its morning adjustment, and beneath that, almost lost, the collective sound of people beginning to move. Lumen did not sound like a city of the ground. It had no traffic, no grinding of wheels on stone. Its morning sound was vertical, the tension of cables and struts, the whispered complaint of suspended things holding themselves in place against the forces that wanted them to fall. Alira was in this city. He felt this the way he sometimes felt the memory threads hum in his teeth, not as reasoning, not as intelligence, but as a sensation that arrived before thought. 5 years of silence, and then last week the trace had come through the monitoring network his people ran through the waste layer, a familiar resonance profile moving through the Holloway black markets, careful and disguised and absolutely recognizable to anyone who knew her work well enough. Which was only him. which had always been only him. She was looking. Of course she was looking. He had known this was coming the way you know, when you've been running from water, that eventually the land runs out. She was brilliant enough to find the trail. She was stubborn enough to follow it into places that would terrify her. She was desperate enough. He opened his hand and looked at the crystal again. The amber had deepened while his fist was closed. The facets were warmer now, more saturated, the color of the light from a lamp in a child's room at night, something that was supposed to be comforting. He wasn't comforted. He never was, and he came up here every morning anyway, and the not comforting had become so familiar that he supposed it served a similar function. He had thought about giving it back. Many times, in many specific imagined scenarios, he had thought about giving it back. Anonymous delivery. A message through a third party. Some constructed scenario where the crystal made its way to Alira's lab, and she found it and she understood, and he did not have to explain himself. He had let himself believe in several of these scenarios for days at a time before the thinking caught up with the wanting. Sienna's resonance was not stable. It had been fragmented at the moment of extraction, scattered across 3 crystal matrices that he had spent 2 years consolidating into one, and the consolidation was imperfect because it always was, and the resulting crystal held her the way a cracked vessel holds water. Adequately, until something disturbed the cracking. The frequency of Alira's grief alone, her specific and devastating love for this specific mind, would be enough. She would hold the crystal and her resonance would reach for Sienna's and Sienna's would reach back and the fragmentation would complete. He would be handing Alira a crystal and watching her watch it go dark in her hand. He had chosen not to do this. He told himself he had chosen it for her sake. His fingers tightened again. What he had chosen, what he was continuing to choose this morning, with the sky going from gray gold to something more insistently luminous behind him, was to keep Sienna here in Holloway's deepest vault, nestled in the archive of lost names, alongside 100 other fragments the unburdened had gathered, and the world had been told were destroyed. Which was the lie he had built his entire movement on. The unburdened did not destroy. They preserved, and the preserving was the secret shame at the center of everything, the thing that would unravel his credibility and his following and the last 10 years of his life if it ever surfaced. Curran the forgetter, Curran of the great unweaving, who could not bring himself to erase a single crystal, who had an entire archive full of what he'd taken. He wrapped the thermal cloth around the crystal again, folded the corners, pressed each edge flat with his thumbnail, returned it to his pocket. The air at the open edge moved differently when the tide wind began, a direction shift that came not as a gust, but as a sustained reorientation of pressure, as if the sky decided to lean. The mid-chain islands would be blooming within the hour. He could see the first stain of bioluminescence beginning at the edges of the nearest one, a pale rose suffusing the membrane of its underbelly, spreading outward from some central node like warmth through a body. Beautiful. He looked at it and felt nothing, which was its own kind of information. Alira had found a collaborator. The resonance trace he'd monitored wasn't hers alone. Another signal, younger and strange, with a quality he hadn't encountered in years of studying resonance profiles. It didn't absorb frequency. It moved it, like a hand on a string not stopping the vibration but redirecting it. Dangerous. He pressed his hand to his chest, to the pocket where the crystal sat. He felt its warmth through the cloth and the leather. The thought arrived without drama, without any of the elaborate architecture of justification he usually built around his decisions. It was small and cold and entirely formed, the way the ugliest thoughts always were. She will find the archive eventually. She was already closer than she knew. If she found it on her own terms, she would take Sienna. She would attempt the reintegration. She would fail because the crystal's fragmentation was too advanced, and her love would accelerate its collapse, and Sienna's resonance would scatter and dissolve, and Alira would hold a dead stone in her hand, and he would lose the only leverage that had ever mattered. But if Alira came to him, if she believed that Sienna could be recovered safely, that someone who understood the fragmentation, who had been managing the crystal's stability for 5 years, could guide the reintegration, if she believed that. She would come. She was already coming. He needed only to let her know the crystal existed, where it was, that it was warm. He turned from the open edge of the platform. The sky behind him was fully morning now, the violet retreating to the upper reaches, the gold claiming everything below. The bloom on the distant island had spread from rose to a deep and burning amber, the same color the crystal made in his hand, and for a moment the coincidence of that felt like something. He dismissed the feeling. He had learned to dismiss that particular category of feeling long ago. He crossed to the narrow ladder and set his hands on the upper rung. Illyra was in this city. Illyra was looking, and in Holloway's deepest vault, in the dark and the cold and the careful silence of a place designed to hold what could not be released, her daughter's mind waited in a crystal the size of a child's molar, warm as a held breath. He began to descend.